I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar with Professor Brian Hughes. It's titled The New NICE Guideline for ME CFS, Following the Science. After the presentation, there's going to be a Q&A, so just write in your questions in the Q&A, and then I'll read them out. I think that Professor Brian Hughes knows a lot more about himself than I do, so I'm going to let him present himself first.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm a professor of psychology in a university in Galway in Ireland. Most of my research is on the interactions of psychological stress and physical illness through physiological processes. But I also have written a lot about the public understanding of psychology and of science, and of the problem of scientific illiteracy in health and healthcare, including in ME CFS, which is a big issue. And I'm on the national working group for ME CFS and a number of other boards and organizations. So today I want to talk about the NICE guidelines emanating from the UK, and tell the story of the the scientific reasoning that feed into these guidelines and that arise from them. I'm going to proceed through, I suppose, 4 stages in the presentation. I'm going to talk about the way NICE reviewed the guidelines and what that implies. I'm going to then broaden it out a little bit to talk about the actual underlying scientific paradigm and why that has changed. So why the thinking has changed around ME CFS. In some ways it has changed for a very long time, but why NICE has changed its thinking, I suppose, is what we're talking about. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenge of achieving change in medicine, and how controversies arise and how people change their minds, or if they change their minds. And ultimately then, in terms of the NICE guidelines, how we proceed from here, what we do next to modernize our practice in the field of ME CFS. And most of my, I suppose, discussion will look at the NICE review and its implications. So don't worry if I spend a bit of time explaining that. The point I want to make about the changing theoretical paradigm and how medical controversies happen, we'll discuss those in a little less detail because the story is a little shorter there. The first thing to consider, though, is I suppose, what is NICE and what is the concept of the review and what it implies. NICE is the UK institution for Health and Care Excellence. And this is the national statutory body, government-established body, and the job of which is to establish treatment guidelines for use in the National Health Service in the UK. Now, these are guidelines, these are treatment recommendations at all times. Because of the ethics of clinical work, individual medical practitioners have the authority to make individual decisions for individual patients. So the way this works is that the national organization establishes guidelines for practice, and then the medical practitioners adhere to those guidelines, taking account their own judgment. Because the United Kingdom is a center internationally for medicine and healthcare generally, and because I suppose it has a long history of publishing scientific research and scientific education, the English language and so on. Because of this, what exists as guidelines in the UK often have an influence in other countries. So in my own country, for example, in Ireland, the health service here explicitly says that it will wait for the UK NICE guideline in order to decide what to do, and it will implement the guideline as close as possible to what the UK decides. I think in other countries there are similar arrangements, and therefore what happens in the UK is very important because it has an influence outside the UK. and we're all therefore affected by what happens here. I think you will be aware, therefore, that for ME/CFS there had originally been a guideline that was established back in 2007, and then there was a review process that was initiated in 2017. And I think it's fair to say that the review process has been described in the media as being somewhat challenging and controversial, and some clinical voices, some medical representatives have criticized the concept of having a review and the outcome of that review. So I think it's important just to explain a few points about how the review took place, because there is a lot of misinformation circulating about the review. The first point to make is that it is standard for NICE to review its guidelines. There is nothing controversial whatsoever about NICE deciding to have another look at an existing guideline and to consider changing that guideline. In fact, that is good medicine, it's good science. You take account of accumulating evidence and you alter your understanding and your practice if the evidence suggests that you need to do so. So the guideline that, the review that was initiated here for ME/CFS practice is completely normal. There's nothing unusual about it whatsoever. They're required to have this type of review from time to time. There was an independent chairperson and an independent vice chairperson who had nothing to do with ME/CFS, but were senior medical consultants in major UK hospitals. These were the people who led the process through the system. The review group comprised 15 clinicians and 5 lay members. And the 5 lay members are patient representatives or equivalent. I think this point is important because some of the media coverage has tried to suggest that the review group was dominated by the lay members. This is simply not the case. Like every other NICE review group, the vast majority of the members were expert clinicians, some of whom were quite loyal to old practices. But nonetheless, they were expert clinicians, and therefore, when presented with the research evidence, they made an expert conclusion. And the role of the lay members was to feed into that discussion in the interest of having the patient voice heard. But remember, the vast majority of this review group were clinicians in the field. The chair was an independent senior medical consultant, as was the vice chair. Another important point to note is that everything was published. So when the guideline review was finalized, it was sent out to the public for consultation in November 2020. There was a very detailed document explaining the new proposed guideline, and there were extra supporting documents explaining the research evidence and the basis for all of these guidelines. There were 10 evidence reviews extending that discussion in detail. And in total, there were 2,733 pages published on the NICE website. And I say this because some of the media coverage, again, has misinformed the public to suggest that the process wasn't transparent and that the decisions were taken in secret and that nobody knew why the changes were being proposed. In fact, 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, in November 2020, nearly 3,000 pages of an explanation was published, and everybody could see this. And so there was nothing unusual about the process and nothing secret about the process. And unsurprisingly then, when the public were invited to make submissions, 4,000 submissions were received. And ultimately, the final version was sent out for fact-checking and then scheduled for release. There was a delay because it seemed that some of the medical colleges in the UK, some of their representatives were pressured to object to the new guideline. But that delay was simply to allow more time for the colleges to familiarize themselves with the content of the guideline and the reasons for the changes. And after that was done, the guidelines were ultimately published virtually unchanged, despite that opportunity for the colleges to have another look. So these draft guidelines were replaced by the final guideline, which was published at the end of October. I think it's important just to reflect momentarily on that process because of the misinformation that is in the public domain. I've seen articles in medical journals, in newspapers. I've seen material emanating from the United Kingdom and from other countries, including from Norway, where it is alleged that the guidelines were not evidence-based and that the guidelines were written by campaigners and that they were scientifically controversial and that they were prepared in secret. None of those points is correct. All of those points are demonstrably incorrect. And when people present that explanation to the public, they are misinforming the public. The guidelines were widely understood across the United Kingdom and were greeted with support by patient groups, science groups, clinical groups, and a wide cross-section of public opinion. There were a small number of clinicians who still have a problem with the new guidelines, but that's a matter for them to explain. So what is new in these guidelines? What has changed in terms of what are now the UK standard for treatment for ME/CFS? There are a few different layers to this, but essentially we'll focus today on diagnosis and management. For diagnosis, it's now required that 4 separate sets of symptoms all have to be present for a patient to receive a diagnosis of ME/CFS, because it was a little unclear in previous guidelines exactly who had ME/CFS and who didn't, and there were some kind of issues regarding the accuracy of diagnoses. The 4 symptoms are fatigability, that is unrelated to exertion, unrefreshing sleep, cognitive difficulties, and post-exertional malaise. And I just want to show you the actual page from the guideline document where this is set out. So just to be absolutely clear, this is the text exactly lifted from the page of the document, and all of these symptoms are required for a patient to be diagnosed with ME/CFS. There is a separate list I will show you as well, that it is identified in the guideline that a person with ME/CFS may well have other symptoms, and they also appear on this list. And I suppose the points to be made here, temperature hypersensitivity, for example, or neuromuscular symptoms. The point to keep in mind here is that it is very clear from the new NICE guideline that ME/CFS is a complicated physical illness for which psychotherapy will be of very little use. So that message comes through very clearly from the guideline, including from the way in which ME/CFS is defined and diagnosed. With regard to the management, or some might say treatment, of ME/CFS, what is new in the guideline is that there is now a focus on symptom management. So for a person with ME/CFS, they will have many of those symptoms, and the effort for healthcare providers, according to NICE, should now be on symptom management. In other words, and I will explain this in a moment, not on curing ME/CFS, because there is no treatment that we know of which can cure ME/CFS. So emphasis on rest, energy management, dietary management, pain management, and so on. Here's the page from the guideline. It tells practitioners that when you have a patient with ME/CFS, you should advise them not to extend their energy more than they can tolerate. They should not try to push through their symptoms. So this is a very clear direction to practitioners as regards what the evidence-based treatment should be, and what the evidence-based treatment should not be as well. So there has been a practice in ME/CFS of engaging patients in exercise therapies that involve pushing through symptoms. Most of the evidence for that is anecdotal or else arising from poor quality research. The preponderance of research evidence suggests that you should not ever do this, and therefore the guideline reflects that evidence base. there is the focus in the guideline is on establishing a specialist team, clinicians who have knowledge in the area. And I would say, as a psychologist, it is very clear from this new guideline that psychologists are very much down the list of professionals who should be involved. The guideline is very clear in establishing that the teams of practitioners should have expertise in ME/CFS arising from training and experience, not just experience, but training and experience. And they are likely to come from disciplines such as rheumatology, neurology, immunology, and so on. There may be a role for some patients, for psychologists and exercise physiologists and so on. And these are the people who have been dominant in UK treatment centres for a long time. However, the guideline simply says this may be necessary for some, but it also therefore may not be. What will be necessary will be rheumatology, neurology, endocrinology, and so on. So again, there is a very clear separation here that this is a physical illness requiring physical management, not psychological management. I don't want to jump ahead in the story, but we might note at this point that if you are a psychologist in the UK heavily involved in treating ME/CFS, it is natural for you to become anxious when you see the new guideline, because it is essentially being identified that your expertise is no longer needed and no longer evidence-based. So this might explain some of the human reaction by clinicians to the new guideline. Let me just explain that the guideline goes into lots of detail on what the team should do. And it identifies all the different types of assessments that should happen: physical functioning, experience of medicines such as side effects of the medicines, a total medical assessment, a dietary assessment, and so on. And finally, this is what clinicians should do in the field. Members of the specialist team, this is the special slide that says essentially what the practice should involve. The practice should involve the development of a care plan specific to the individual, and that care plan should include aspects to do with informing the patient about their illness, support for daily living, such as home care and assistance with meals. In other words, making sure a person has quality of life despite their illness, mobility aids, maybe modifications to a house or the provision of a wheelchair if necessary for some patients, assistance with persons with ME to attend college training or the workplace, not to try to cure the patient so that they can do it themselves, but actually the treatment plan should include ways of supporting persons with ME/CFS to fulfill occupational goals, self-management strategies, including for energy, symptom management strategies, including medication, because many patients will have pain and other symptoms that are responsive to medication, guidance on what to do, training. In other words, we sometimes refer to this as psychoeducation, training a patient to prepare them to what they need to do in different situations, such as if they have a relapse. And of course, practical access to the relevant healthcare professionals that they need, treatment pathways, contact numbers, emergency contacts, and so on. So the plan, the support plan that NICE requires for patients with ME/CFS involves clinical input, but it is a very practical treatment plan. And the emphasis is on support and not cure, because that's what the evidence suggests should be the focus. There is a lack of cure for ME/CFS. The research evidence on the treatment attempts that have been made in the past have not shown us that any particular intervention succeeds in curing this complex physical illness. The two treatments that have commonly been recommended and that were previously recommended by the old NICE guideline are, of course, graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, there are two references here in the NICE guideline to these two treatments. And in short, the story is that graded exercise therapy should no longer be offered. There is no evidence base to support the use of graded exercise therapy. There is some evidence to suggest that graded exercise therapy is in fact counterproductive and harmful to patients. For cognitive behavioral therapy, similarly, there is no evidence to support its use as a treatment or cure. But of course, any human being who requires emotional support or psychotherapy should be provided with it. And having a chronic illness, especially one with so many symptoms, is a distressing experience. And as a psychologist, I would recommend to all patients of medical illness to consider psychotherapy support if and when they need emotional support. And that's what the guideline says as well. But the emphasis here is that CBT is not a cure for ME/CFS. It might be useful support for some patients, but it's not a cure for the illness. This is what the page of the guideline says about graded exercise therapy. Just to be clear, in case you feel I am summarizing too much, it says explicitly, do not offer any program that uses fixed increments, for example, graded exercise therapy. So this is a clear direction from the evidence-based guidelines established by the government of the United Kingdom. Do not offer graded exercise therapy. It's not, sometimes a clinician will say, I think it might be useful. This guideline tells that clinician, even if you think it might be useful, do not offer it. So this is a clear direction. It's a negative direction, but it's a clear direction. For cognitive behavioral therapy, it explains that it requires the clinician to explain to the patient that it is not a cure for ME/CFS, it's emotional support. So that instruction is there in a treatment guideline. If you follow the treatment guidelines established for the National Health Service, you must explain that CBT does not cure ME/CFS. And it does not assume that cognitions cause illness. Okay, so CBT is simply a service for people who require cognitive behavioral support in dealing with emotional issues. And we all can benefit from emotional support from professionals at different stages of our lives. And people with chronic illnesses have the same needs as everybody else, and sometimes specialized needs in terms of the stresses that they face. That's where CBT comes in with the new guideline. So I think it's fair to say that the new guideline is fundamentally different to the old guideline, but the new guideline is extensive, is focused on medical specialisms, is focused on a structured care pathway and package, and is clear on explaining what you should do with the old treatments. You should not offer graded exercise therapy, and you should only offer cognitive behavior therapy in the normal sense of psychotherapy. You should only offer it for the normal reasons. I know a lot of people talk about the lightning process, and in some countries the lightning process receives more attention than in others. And I know that you will be aware in Norway of the lightning process. The guideline here is very clear. Just as with graded exercise therapy, even if you as a clinician think it might be a good idea, the guideline arising from the research evidence is that you should not offer the lightning process. It's not that you might try it to see if it works. Even if you want to, you can't. Do not offer the lightning process to people with ME/CFS. And that's arising from the research evidence evaluation. And I'll explain that a little bit in a few moments. So that is the NICE review and its implications. That is the package of changes that have been proposed. And it involves, if you like, that's the end result of the thought process. I want to spend now a couple of moments, short moments, talking about that thought process itself, because there are reasons for these changes, and I think it's fair to say that what we're looking at is a change in the paradigm, what we call a paradigm shift, or a change in the way in which medicine thinks about this problem. Now, in reality, medicine has moved on a long time ago. It's the guidelines that are catching up with medicine and the guidelines that are catching up with medical research now, rather than changing, the understanding just by changing a guideline. The new guideline reflects the understanding that has emerged. There was a time when medicine felt that many illnesses were caused by psychological processes and psychological weakness, and that is certainly part of the history here of ME/CFS. And I think some of you will be aware that in the 1950s in Britain there was an outbreak of benign myalgic encephalomyelitis in the Royal Free Hospital in London, but that some years later some psychiatrists concluded that the outbreak was actually caused by mass hysteria. And this is a very important moment because it linked myalgic encephalomyelitis with psychological cause. But it didn't do so on the basis of strong research evidence. It did so on the basis of a kind of a retrospective reflection by some psychiatrists. But that idea took hold and it influenced many practitioners. For those of you who use TikTok, I have actually presented a short video on this on TikTok. It's 1 minute long, and I'll actually show it to you now because it sets the scene for the change in thinking, and it explains a few points. I will say to you that because it's TikTok, it moves very quickly. So you can go to TikTok later and listen back a couple of more times if you don't get all the details here. But I hope this is helpful in setting the scene. Oh, excuse me, I'll go back. I need to press the button.
In 1955, between July and November, nearly 300 staff members at London's Royal Free Hospital fell ill with debilitating symptoms. The doctors at the time thought at first that they were looking at an outbreak of glandular fever, but later they settled on a diagnosis that they called benign myalgic encephalomyelitis. However, in 1970, two psychiatrists published a paper in the British Medical Journal claiming that the Royal Free outbreak was actually caused by mass hysteria. And how did they come to this conclusion? Well, they decided that it must have been mass hysteria because most of the patients were women. At the beginning of their paper, they said the fact the patients were women was a sign the outbreak was mass hysteria. At the end of their paper, they said the fact the outbreak was mass hysteria was a sign that the patients were women. I guess we would call that a circular argument. The two psychiatrists drew their mass hysteria conclusion 15 years after the outbreak without examining any patients, and in spite of the fact that the doctors who did originally examine the patients had already rejected the possibility of mass hysteria. Their paper helped popularize the view that women are less reliable than men when it comes to reporting symptoms, a medical stereotype that persists to the present day.
So there you have it. Very, very quick story, but it's an important piece of the puzzle because this event was the main reason why British medical doctors and senior psychiatrists said that they were the ones best placed to deal with ME/CFS, that it was in fact mass hysteria rather than a physical illness. But the source of this argument was a re-evaluation of an outbreak from a distance. So the clinical doctors in the institution said it was a physical illness. The psychiatrists 15 years later from behind their desks said, well, they think it's something else. And there is definitely an element of sexism involved because the reasoning they employed was it affects mostly women, so it must be psychological. We call this the cognitive behavioral or psychogenic model of ME/CFS. And it has been presented in some academic journals and medical journals over the years, and is used as the reason for psychotherapy approaches to ME/CFS, for the use of cognitive behavioral therapy for ME/CFS. And it's grounded in this concept that the person makes themselves sick by thinking the wrong way about illness, or what we call dysfunctional assumptions. It describes that an ME/CFS patient experiences a vicious cycle, so that they become unwell, then they believe themselves to be sicker than they really are, and by their behavior, they make themselves even more sick. They become trapped in chronic illness because they stay in bed and become unwell and unfit and end up sicker than they started. And this vicious cycle, which says that psychological thought processes drive patients to make themselves sick and sicker, is the theory of cognitive behavioral ME/CFS. And therefore, the cure, according to these people, is cognitive behavioral therapy to undo the thought process. But there are many limitations with this, and some of them are quite obvious, I suppose. Firstly, this is entirely a speculation-based model. It's entirely based on psychological processes. There is no biological mechanism involved. So they call it a biopsychosocial model, but it's really a psychosocial model. It's based always on self-report and never on biomedical information. It draws logical, illogical conclusions from the absence of information. For example, if you have a negative blood test, that doesn't mean that you are perfectly healthy. It just means that the test hasn't found what it was looking for. You might have some other illness or some other mechanism in your body that is making you ill. Maybe the blood test is insufficient. But in this field, the psychiatrists tend to draw inferences from negative tests when those inferences are not actually sound. And that's a problem with any medical approach or any scientific theory. It is biologically implausible that the symptoms of ME/CFS can be caused by thought processes alone. And I do a lot of research on this type of issue, but the field I look at most is the impact of psychological stress on blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. And cardiovascular surgeons and cardiologists and cardiovascular physiologists will explain in detail why elevated blood pressure can contribute to heart attacks and atherosclerosis and various cardiovascular outcomes. There is a clear understanding in medicine as to why stress responses will cause physical problems. There is no such clear understanding in ME/CFS as to why changed thought patterns or behavioral patterns will cause the specific biological symptoms that we see. For example, in some patients with ME/CFS, their fingerprints begin to disappear. And this is indicative of cellular deterioration in the body. And there is no understood mechanism in medicine as to why a different thought process will cause that type of cellular effect in the human body. So that's the missing link that they never talk about. There is a clear missing link between the psychological and the biological in this field. And two important points, I suppose, in terms of the scientific evidence base, is that if the cognitive behavioral model was true, we should see two things. One is we should see patients being cured by cognitive behavioral treatment. And secondly, we should see people getting sick because of poor cognitions. Now, let me just explain those 2 points separately, because these are important scientific points, and this is where the whole thing begins to come apart. The first point to make is that while we have lots of research to say that people who receive cognitive behavior therapy will report feeling better in a questionnaire, patients who are treated with cognitive behavior therapy never show improvements in actual biomedical outcomes, objectively measurable outcomes. So patients ME/CFS patients who receive CBT or GET never show an improvement in fitness levels or exercise tests results or endurance strength measures or actometer data such as Fitbit data. They never show improvements in their ability to pursue occupational goals by attending school or attending work. And they never become less disabled when you measure it in terms of the cost of living that they face. So the disability-related costs are the same. So we have many ways of looking at outcomes. And every time CBT and graded exercise therapy are used, we never see those outcomes happening. We never see those improvements. So it is understood that lots of studies show anecdotally that questionnaire results suggest these patients report feeling better. But that's a different matter. You have to remember that cognitive behavior therapy teaches a patient to think about their lives differently. So it may well be the case that the patient says they feel better now than they did before therapy, but this is likely because they have reduced their expectations. They are still sick, they still feel sick, and they still feel symptoms, but they think differently about those symptoms because cognitive behavior therapy has taught them to do so and has taught them to reduce their expectations in life. So there is no evidence that CBT does anything other than change the way people fill out questionnaires. There is certainly no evidence that CBT has any effect on physical health after treatment in people with ME/CFS. And there's lots of studies. There are lots and lots and lots of studies. The other way of looking at the problem is to identify healthy people and then follow them until they get sick. And we know that, certainly we see with COVID, for example, we know that when a large number of people get infected with a virus, a subset of them will develop symptoms that look like ME/CFS. This is old information. It's not just COVID, it's any virus. And these researchers published a paper in 2020, as it happens, and they found a population of people that were tracked for a very long time and were able to identify those who acquired viruses or became infected by viruses and had lots of psychological information about them before they became ill. And to make the story simple, what the researchers showed was that the people who ended up with ME/CFS started out psychologically the same as everybody else. There was no psychological difference between them. There was no evidence that they had different thought styles or thought patterns or personality types. There was no evidence to support the idea that cognitive behavioral factors were the cause of their illness. People who were cognitively and behaviorally the same as them, other people didn't get sick at all. Only some of these people had ME/CFS after viral infection. And that suggests that the causes had nothing to do with cognitive and behavioral differences. So we have lots of strong research evidence that disproves the theory of that cognitive behavioral processes are involved in ME/CFS, and therefore disproves the claim that cognitive behavioral treatment will be any use. So there are many limitations with this model, and that's the paradigm that has shifted. Medicine has moved away from this model a long time ago. A small number of psychiatrists who have made their living working on ME/CFS and psychologists have repeated their claim that this model is true, but nobody in medical science agrees with this. That is the shift of the paradigm, and the NICE guideline, as I say, didn't cause this shift. The NICE guideline reflects this shift. The NICE review board are simply following the science. So let me conclude with two small reflections on the future, on how things change and what we might expect to happen next. We do know that medicine, like any occupation, can be slow to change. There are many incidents throughout history where medical reasoning and medical thinking was wrong, but that when the evidence was brought up, that only some medical practitioners followed the science. We do have a problem in medicine at times, as we do in education, as we do in other occupations, that when the research evidence suggests we should do things differently, only some of the practitioners want to do that. So we need to move from the old normal to the new normal, but it is always going to be a medical challenge or an occupational challenge. It's always going to be a controversy. I talk about it as a paradigm shift. Some of you may know that philosophers have talked about this in science all the time, that science doesn't necessarily progress with one study at a time. Science often takes many leaps forward, and many scientists change their ideas very, very reluctantly. And what tends to happen is that everything is going ordinarily. There's a normal understanding of the world. And then something raises doubt about this. It causes a crisis, and people have to change their ideas. And quantum physics would be an example, or the discovery of microorganisms, the discovery of bacteria and things like this. All of these things changed the way scientists looked at the world, and it moved the new normal, the old normal into a new normal. And then the cycle repeats itself. So we have a massive shift in understanding, and then we move on to the next research agenda. This is the idea of scientific revolutions. Science doesn't change gradually over time. science takes leaps forward and then stays the same, then another leap forward and then stays the same. It is that jump that we're experiencing at the moment. And understandably, science only works on the basis of the information you have at the time. So the NICE guideline for ME-CFS gives us a very good example of this, because the old guideline was constructed in 2007. And when those reviewers examined the evidence, they had 4 CBT studies to look at and 5 graded exercise therapy studies to look at. They didn't critique the methods of these studies, which is of interest because these studies were known to be problematic in methodological terms. They just reported the findings. And the 2007 guideline said you might as well try CBT and GET because some studies suggest they might be useful. And there was a very small evidence base with no critical evaluation. By comparison, the 2020 review, which preceded the 2021 guideline, had a much larger evidence base to look at because with the passing of time, more and more studies were conducted. And this is why it is misinformation to say that the evidence was reinterpreted or that NICE changed its mind. NICE and the review body didn't change its mind, they just reviewed new evidence and a lot more evidence. And the scientific consensus moves when the evidence changes. And unlike the old review, the new review had a much larger set of research findings to consider. And having examined 172 CBT study outcomes and 64 graded exercise therapy study outcomes, they concluded that there was no evidence base to support either treatment. That for ME-CFS, most of the studies reduced to poor quality research, amounting to essentially anecdotal evidence or ambiguous survey data. There were many intervention studies, but at the end of the intervention study, the researchers would administer a survey instrument. And you wouldn't be able to say that the research groups in the intervention study were properly independent or properly blinded. So it was poor quality evidence, but a much more thorough review, more studies and a critical analysis. And this is why the consensus changed. The big problem, of course, is the echo chamber of research, that people do the same study over and over again and achieve a misleading finding over and over again. It is important that entities like NICE conduct independent reviews or commission independent reviews every so often to establish the actual facts of the issue rather than the interpretation that the researchers themselves want you to believe. So finally, how do we change? Well, this is going to be very brief because some of it is just common sense, but some of it is also science and occupational psychology. We know that trying to institute cultural change in a profession or an organization is very difficult. It involves many steps. You cannot just publish new guidelines and expect everyone to change their understanding. So you need to cultivate a developmental process that changes people's minds or changes people's awareness. In my experience, most clinical professionals working in health contexts want this information. They want to change. They just want to understand what's going on. So you need to cultivate a sense of need for new information. You need to recruit individuals to go out there and explain to their colleagues why things are changing. You need to have good quality communication and incentives for people to take time out of their busy careers to study new data and new procedures. So all of these things are practical challenges that we cannot shy away from, because human beings don't just change their minds easily. They need to be given the opportunity and the motivation to do so. So I would say there's an organizational cultural change process required, and I hope that the healthcare system is prepared for that and carries that through. But there is an old saying from Max Planck that scientists change their minds very, very reluctantly. And what tends to happen is that the old scientists retire or die, and the new scientists carry forward the new ideas. And his explanation of, instead of instituting culture change in an organization, was to basically expect change to happen one retirement at a time. He actually said one funeral at a time, but that's a bit morbid. But the idea is that, maybe some of this change will be gradual, because we will simply have to wait for the new people to carry forward the ideas, because the old people perhaps are less likely to do so. I would say, though, every time I explain this principle, many senior clinicians in the UK and in other countries are very scientifically aware and very frustrated with their colleagues who wish to keep things in the past. And some young professionals are very misled, and they will write articles and make presentations defending the old guidelines instead of the new ones. So it's wrong to generalize the way Max Planck suggests. But I think if you look at any profession, there will always be that challenge of shifting minds, and some people will never change their minds, but they will eventually move on to other things. We do need to address clinical fears. As a psychologist, I would say, there's a lot of misinformation. Clinicians are human beings. Some of them have invested their livelihoods and their careers and their reputations in the old system. And NICE understands this. Every time the guidelines change, you have the same problem, regardless of the area of medicine you're dealing with. Clinicians will have to break down their current jobs and start a new job. That's essentially what they're being asked to do. As I say, in my experience, most clinicians are happy to do this. They feel obliged to their patients. They're conscientious. They want to do the right thing. But some are very invested and they don't want to change practice. Misinformation, I've mentioned a couple of times, is extremely common. There's a lot of fake news in this area, most of it being produced by clinicians who have heavily invested themselves in cognitive behavior therapy. But disliking the rules is not a basis for ignoring the rule book. We now have new guidelines for this area of medicine, and we should just focus on implementing them. We focus on establishing ways of assembling these specialist teams, of establishing the pathways, of removing the graded exercise concept, of emphasizing the usefulness of psychotherapy for emotional support, but not as a cure for ME/CFS. We should just really move on and get into the future and follow the science. I will place some further material. I will tweet it maybe, or you can Google these articles. These are on my blog. You get a little recap there as to what the current state of play is with the new guideline and the challenge of making science happen in a clinical care context. But otherwise, thank you very much for your time and attention today.
Thank you for your enlightening presentation. We'll now have received quite a few questions, but while I read this out, the time to type in your question is now, so we might get more. The first, what type of psychological research would you, as a psychology professor, like to see in the field of ME/CFS in the future? Or what type of information research in the field lacking with regards to the field of psychology?
Yes, I mean, that's an interesting question. Psychology research happens throughout the healthcare system and trying to find ways to make the system work better. And I actually think most of the research should be invested on organizational processes, on getting practitioners to do their job more effectively, because that's a psychological challenge, on improving the quality of medical healthcare provision. We would call this organizational psychology in some senses. In terms of patients, I think there might be some research that could be done on patient understanding and patient advocacy, in equipping patients with the skills and abilities to ask the right questions of their healthcare providers. There's a lot of research that could be done there that is rarely done there, but I think it's very important because we do have challenges of that nature across medicine, where patients follow whatever it is their clinician says and feel that they lack the power to ask the right questions. So actually my interest in psychological research here is very different to most other people. I do not believe there is a basis to do research trying to cure ME/CFS using psychotherapy. To my mind, there is so little basis to that it's actually unethical to do that research. But of course, any research that helps patients cope emotionally with any challenge would also be valuable, but that research goes on all the time.
Thank you. And another one, if we face supporters of the psychogenic model of ME/CFS, do you have any tips on how we should address them to make them realize the errors of their ways and that their theoretical framework is implausible for ME/CFS patients?
Yeah, I think that point almost reminds me of the previous point I just made in terms of how we create a situation where patients can advocate for themselves as adults in a healthcare setting. It's a big challenge because medicine by tradition emphasizes the importance of listening to patients, but it's often not very good at this. So it's a good question to ask, what can we do as non-medics, or what can patients do to fix this problem? I think the more that documentation is assembled by activist groups or patient representative groups that links the science to the practice, and the more that can be highlighted, the more that can be shared, the better. Unfortunately, if a patient simply says to a doctor, I think you're wrong, and I've read it somewhere, and I know that you're wrong, that's not going to change the doctor's approach. You need to have access to materials to show them the evidence base. Most doctors will accept the evidence base when it's presented to them. I think the challenge we face is that the information is not getting to them in the way it should. So whatever the solution is, it has to involve passing information to doctors. And I'm sure there are ways that doctors can do this. I know for rare conditions, for rare illnesses, genetic disorders that very few people have, 1 in 100,000 and so on, the patient groups in those conditions place a strong emphasis on the patients having the information to give to the doctor. And that method is necessary for a very rare condition, but might also be useful for other conditions such as ME/CFS.
And now the first named question, Martin Saberista. Thank you for a very interesting presentation first. And he has 2 questions. One, the NICE guidelines seems to exclude or at least downgrade the importance of physical and cognitive therapy. These forms of therapy have previously been used heavily for ME/CFS. Does the NICE guidelines, or do you recommend any treatments for ME/CFS? If not, what then?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable question, because this is the way clinicians often think about the problem. And we wish to, clinicians talk about optimism and pessimism, and they want to avoid clinical pessimism. It is true, the NICE guideline excludes graded exercise and physical therapy, generally speaking, and downgrades cognitive therapy in the sense of it identifies that cognitive therapy is of no use as a treatment. But as I explained in the presentation, cognitive therapy can be used for emotional support, as it can be in heart disease or any other illness. So the crux of the matter here is that there is no understanding in medicine or evidence in medicine to support the use of any treatment as a cure for ME/CFS. As things stand, all the treatments that have been attempted have failed, including CBT and GET. Therefore, ME/CFS is a chronic incurable illness. That might sound pessimistic, but it is factual. Therefore, the guidelines focus, because many illnesses, unfortunately, are chronic and incurable. ME/CFS is not the only illness to be chronic and incurable. So what the NICE guideline focuses on, as in any other incurable illness, is on symptom management and maximizing the quality of life. And that is why we have all of those specialist services built into the treatment plan concept. And people can have supported lives that are fulfilling and that achieve quality of life. And of course, the medical research should continue and people should attempt to find a cure for ME/CFS. But as we stand currently, we cannot recommend treatments because we hope they work when we know from research evidence that they don't. So we need to move away from the optimism-pessimism concept and move towards realism. No patient with ME/CFS is helped if they are given a treatment that does not work. So the most important guideline is to not do that. And the NICE guideline is very clear. I believe there's another question there.
Yes, his second question. I know that many healthcare workers, from doctors to physical therapists, focus a lot on stress. A search in the NICE guidelines show that distress only occurs 4 times, and as far as I can see, only in association with having the illness and a lack of understanding from others. Can you elaborate on this? Do you believe that the focus on stress is entirely useless for ME/CFS?
No, I don't think it's entirely useless, as it isn't useless for patients with cancer or patients with heart disease or patients with diabetes. These, having chronic illnesses or potentially very debilitating illnesses, is stressful. And in order to fulfill quality of life goals, it is helpful to have some kind of support. So in that sense, absolutely. But the important issue to bear in mind is that none of these psychological supports will actually remove the illness or make the person less biologically dysfunctional. So if you have high blood pressure due to atherosclerosis, you can have cognitive behavior therapy to make you less stressed, but it's not going to reduce your blood pressure or your atherosclerosis. So I think we need to just separate our thinking. This is the most important point. So the NICE guideline for ME/CFS does not delve into stress management in detail, because stress management is a generic need across healthcare. And if you look at the NICE guideline for diabetes, it doesn't delve into stress management detail either, or the NICE guidelines for, myocardial infarction or coronary bypass surgery. These things are very stressful for patients. Stress management is helpful, but there's no need for the NICE guideline to talk in generic terms about stress management. The only focus of the guideline should be on the illness concerned. So yes, stress management is useful in healthcare, but it's not specifically extra useful in ME/CFS, and it doesn't cure ME/CFS.
The last question, a question from Arild Angelsen. In what way did patient experiences enter the evidence based for the review of the guidelines?
Yeah, so the evidence base is established. There is a website on our web page that NICE have published all the evidence bases and all the research reviews. And there are hundreds of pages of detailed analysis of each of the study findings that were considered. The research review was independently conducted. The studies were evaluated using a system recommended by many medical authorities called the GRADE system, where studies were categorized in terms of their research strengths. And this was done by research methodology experts. And on the basis of that, then, the culmination of the review was the recommendation that there is no evidence base for these treatments, for cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy. There was no patient input in that process. The final research review was then published on the website and was submitted to the Guideline Committee. The Guideline Committee, composed of 15 clinical experts and 5 patient representatives, took receipt of that and approved that as the independent report of a review committee. So in terms of evaluating the research, or conducting the research review and evaluating the evidence base, patient representatives were not involved in producing the outcome of that research evaluation. But they were a part of the committee that took receipt of that evaluation by the methodology experts and approved it on behalf of NICE, but only because the majority of the committee agreed with them, and the majority of the committee being clinical experts. So I suppose I'm focusing here on the point that sometimes is made that patients controlled the outcome. Patients had no control over the outcome of this process. The outcome was driven by clinical expertise, including research expertise.
Next question, Katrine Engsig. The Danish Health Board, who support the old paradigm of CBT and get to ME, claims that they now use compassionate physiotherapy, where they listen to the patients and do not press the patient. What's your comment to this?
Well, it's good that they don't use graded exercise therapy. Comment number one. Therefore, it is good that they adhere to the NICE guideline and avoid using a therapy that encourages patients to push themselves through their limits. That concept is no longer valid. So in one sense, this is a good action to take. I hope that the Danish Health Board also considers the rest of the NICE guideline and encourages the use of multidisciplinary teams to manage treatment plans and support plans at an individual level for patients that involve all of the different medical specialisms that NICE have identified. If the Danish Health Board are only using compassionate physiotherapy and nothing else, well, clearly they are not adhering to the NICE guideline. They're choosing to think that they have more information than NICE have looked at to make a different conclusion to NICE. But I would encourage all clinical organizations to reflect on the reasoning in the NICE guideline and the evidence, the role of evidence in the NICE guideline, and hope that they can expand their understanding to take account of the full NICE guideline, not just the instruction to avoid graded exercise therapy.
Thank you. That was our last question, and we'll thank you for joining us and for your interesting presentation and answering our questions. Before everyone leaves, I will just say that on April the 5th, Nina Langland, professor at Bergen University, she is going to join us and talk about her research on post-infectious diseases. For instance, the work she did on an outbreak of the Giardia. So that's going to be very interesting, I think. So everyone join us on April the 5th. Thank you.
Thank you so much.